Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Everyone Counts webinar series on environmental justice and environmental racism. I'm your host here tonight, Reverend Dr. Stacy Cole-Wilson. I serve as the Executive Minister of Justice and Service for the Baltimore-Washington Conference. We're so glad that you are able to participate in this vital conversation and to join us and offer your full presence in this moment. Just want to orient you to some of the features before I share a little bit about why we're here tonight. We have the question and answer section. We invite you at any time throughout this session to place your questions there. We also invite you to share your comments in the chat section. Please note that this is recorded. This experience is recorded and will be sent to all who are officially registered for this event. You can also find the recording tonight on the YouTube channel, bwcumc.org. You can find it there and on our BWC YouTube channel. With that said, I just want to share with you, why are we here tonight? Why have you taken time out of your busy schedule to come here? As United Methodists, we know it is our moral obligation to be just, to speak out, to care for God's creation, and to challenge systems of injustice. And according to our United Methodist social principles, the 160th paragraph, we know that all creation is the Lord's, and we're responsible for the ways in which we use and abuse it. Water, air, soil, minerals, energy, resources, plants, animal life, and space are to be valued and conserved because they are God's creation, and not solely because they are useful to human beings. We also understand environmental racism as defined by our 2016 Book of Resolutions is the disproportionate toxic and industrial contamination in neighborhoods where people of color live, work, worship, and play. And so as United Methodists, as people of God, as people of faith, we are committed to understanding and eliminating environmental racism. In the United States, the extraction, production, storage, treatment, and disposal process of hazardous materials and waste are too often zoned within close proximity to where people of color live. And tonight, you will hear from several panelists as we discuss how these issues directly impact us. As your host tonight, I am joined by Reverend Del Hinton, elder in the Baltimore-Washington Conference and Glow Ministries Earth Keeper. Reverend Carrie James, elder in the Baltimore-Washington Conference and also a Global Ministries Earth Keeper. Mike Koob, the Baltimore-Washington Conference Creation Care Advocacy and Action Chair, the Action and Advocacy Chair of the and Global Ministries Earth Keeper. And this evening, your moderator will be Ms. Cynthia Taylor, the BWC General Conference Delegation Lady Co-Chair. Before I turn our time over to our moderator, before we pray, and before I offer you a poll so that you can share where you're joining us from tonight, I just invite you to take a brief moment of silence, just a brief moment of silence, to pray for God's people here and around the world. Thank you. Tonight, before we launch deep into the deep, I'm going to invite you. You should see a poll come up on your screen right now, and it's asking, where is your district or region? And so tonight, we just invite you to let us know where you are joining us from tonight. We have about, 80% have voted already. That's pretty good. Thank you. We see that the majority have joined us, it seems, from the Greater Washington region, Greater Washington District. Again, thank you so much for participating in this poll. And at this time, I'm going to invite our moderator to please lead us in this informative time and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy. To begin our panel discussion tonight, we're going to have our panelists make 2 to 3 minute opening statements. And I ask that in your opening statements, you respond to the question, what brought you to work around environmental justice and environmental racism? And we'll start with Reverend Kerry James.
Greetings. Thank you, Cynthia, for moderating, and thank you, Reverend Dr. Stacy Cole Wilson, for hosting us. My name is Kerry James, and I grew up on a family farm in Alabama. And so I was accustomed to being close to nature, being close to the soil, and actually growing the produce that we shared as a family, that we gave away at church, and that as we sold also at the farmer's market. And so I was a huge fan growing up right outside of Tuskegee, Alabama, of George Washington Carver. And so George Washington Carver inspired me to pursue a degree in environmental engineering. And so I served as a senior engineer for one of the leading engineering firms in the DMV. And while I was there, I had this unrest. God agitated me and called me from saving the planet as an engineer to saving souls and also saving the planet as an evangelist. And so God called me into full-time ministry, and I'm so excited about this work. I'm able to integrate my theology as well as my vocation now. And it is a great thing because the earth is the Lord's, and we are called to be good stewards of God's creation. And so what brought me to this work is just an outgrowth of who I am, who I was growing up, and even my training in the corporate world, my educational training as well. And so most recently, I applied to the Global Ministries Earthkeeper program, and that program is an outstanding program. It equips United Methodists in the United States to put our creation care values into action in our churches and also in our communities through local projects. The program begins with training to equip participants to develop a plan to implement or grow a project in our community during the training. During the training, we studied eco-theology, community organizing, anti-racism, project planning, strategies for social change, and a lot of United Methodist resources. Following the training, I launched my Soil to the Sanctuary Urban Community Gardens project to address food insecurity. And what I found is in Washington, D.C., 1 out of every 3 children live in poverty. And so this program has equipped me to do something about that. No child in the wealthiest nation should ever go hungry. And so this is a continuation of my passion, my work, and I'm so glad to be a part of this and to serve as one of the first African-American Earth Keepers in the Baltimore-Washington Conference. And I look forward to furthering this work with our project in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Reverend James. I'd like to now go to Reverend Del Hinton.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me on this time together. The question is, what brought me to this?
Yes.
My son, both of my sons have terrible allergies, and they have kept us in and out of the hospital basically their entire childhood. But more specifically, one has crippling asthma. And as I looked at the level of allergens in the air, the things that we were coming around, and both of my children ended up having lead paint poisoning, I had to stop and look at the environment that we were in. So my interest has come from trying to definitely make the environment more healthy. And I also grew up in the country, and my experience in the country indicated that no one was as ill as my children were in an urban or suburban area. And I had to figure out a way to make that work and get back to my roots. When I stop and I look at my grandfather's farm, It was a log cabin, one of the few log cabins that was still standing in the Maryland area up until about 10 to 15 years ago. He had, our water source came from a well, and the water was imported up to the house by bucket. Everything that was done in that environment had to come together as one, as a small ecosystem, so that no food source was contaminated, no one got ill by the things that were being done on the property, and that environment worked for everyone. He had 7 children, and all of the 7 children came to that farm and took away big bags of vegetables and things of that nature to take home to eat. And that was the healthiest food that we had. So when I stopped and I looked at the condition of my children and looked at how I grew up, I knew there was something that was missing. I am an elder here in the Baltimore-Washington Conference. I am the elder serving at Glen Oak and Arlington New in charge. I am a global earth keeper, but I'm also matriculating at St. Mary's Seminary and a doctorate of ministry. And my concentration is creation care. And through that lens, I'm looking at it through the lens of eco-womanism. And right now, my interest goes even further as I'm working on the Maryland State Constitution for environmental human rights. And in the local church, I'm looking at trying to establish green teams, and we're currently working with IPC on water justice and exploring alternative energy sources while making our space healthy for everyone. I don't know about you, but with all of this rain, a lot of moisture is showing up, and we have built our places in such a way that people are having respiratory problems. And I'm afraid for my children to come into those environments. I'm afraid for them to stand out in Baltimore City sometimes according to the way the wind is blowing and how those particulates come into their being. I'm afraid for the children that walk the streets, that go into schools that are lead paint poison, have lead base in that their paint is lead base, and how they are receiving that. And also the water that comes through their taps. The water itself is good, but often the pipes are old and decaying and are giving our children problems. So I've come to this out of my own personal experience and a desire to make things right for not just my children, who are now grown, but for all children and all of us, for we are all children of God.
Thank you, Reverend Hinton. I also wanted to take a moment to introduce Daphne Hurd. Daphne is a leader in the Baltimore-Washington Conference, United Methodist Women, and is also a leader in the NEJ of United Methodist Women. So Daphne, with that, I'd like you to give us your opening statement and also respond to the question of what brought you to work around environmental justice and environmental racism.
Thanks, Cynthia. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for inviting me. I'm not on the NEJ, but I wish I were. But currently, I am the Membership Nurture and Outreach Coordinator for the Baltimore-Washington Conference, United Methodist Women. And I really became interested in environmental justice and environmental racism by attending Mission U. Each year, Mission U sponsors topics for the women to study. And for 4 years, I was actually in charge of the learning centers, 2 years with climate justice and 2 years with people with disabilities. And I just was appalled at some of the things that I sort of took for granted, that I really never put them together. But the United Methodist Women engage in social action projects, things that come from our biblical, theological, and from our Wesleyan heritage. We look to the Bible and to the United Methodist Church social policies, and we prioritize the needs for women, children, and youth. So I was really excited to learn that we're really doing things that are affecting people around the world. Later on, I'll tell you about the two eye openers, because I know we only have 2 or 3 minutes. So that's why I'm really interested, because there is a lot going on that we don't think is really environmental racism or an injustice, and we need to do more work with it.
Thank you, Daphne. And our last panelist is Mike Koo. And Mike, I'd like you to give us your opening statement. Mike, you need to unmute. Mike.
I'm going to unmute. Thank you, Cynthia, so much.
You're welcome.
So I came at this from a concern about climate change. And, you know, I believe if you see something, you need to say something. You need to sound the alarm. And my way of doing that has been through education and advocacy. I helped start the Creation Care team at my church in Middletown United Methodist Church in the Frederick District. And I was at that for a while, not only education programs for members of my church, but the wider community around my church. And 4 years ago, when the Earth Keepers program was first launched by the General Board of Global Ministries, I was just so excited to be part of that inaugural class, to be with other United Methodists from around the country and even around the world who had a great deal of concern about the environment. I've taught children, youth, and adults in different settings, in our church setting at Camp Manidokin, and also as a substitute teacher. When I look out at young people with the knowledge that already we're feeling the sting of climate change, knowing that the young people are going to be subject to a bitter bite around climate change, it just makes me called to action. Fortunately, I have a partner. My wife Sherry and I are the only married couple in the Baltimore-Washington conference that are Earth Keepers, but we're not the only ones in the Northeast jurisdiction, right? We know some other married couples who are Earth Keepers, but my partnership with Sherry, we have taught the climate justice class together several times, and that was a class put together by the United Methodist Women. So I believe the climate crisis is really a moral crisis. The environmental crisis is a moral crisis. Environmental racism is a moral crisis. The damage to the community of all creation couldn't be possible without the existence of sacrifice zones and the attitude that some people are disposable. And I'll get into that some more.
Thanks, Mike. And again, I want to welcome everyone and thank you all for attending. And thank you, Mike and the committee, for inviting me to be your moderator tonight. And I'll just speak briefly about my involvement. It actually happened many years ago when I was very involved with Church and Society. And I began to hear about toxic waste dumps being located in communities of color and poor communities. I started hearing about schools being located in areas where the exhaust from trucks and different companies were creating situations where children were getting asthma or getting respiratory conditions. And as the years went by, I started to get more involved in learning more about this and what could be done. And I was very blessed to have Mike as my teacher at Mission U in 2018, I think it was, in their climate justice course. And after that, I enrolled in a course with the United Methodist Women that was done by the national group. It was a 3-session training called Just Energy for All. And we looked at why that was important. We looked at understanding just what it is, and then we looked at advocacy and action. In July, they started a monthly session called Just Energy for All Strategy and Capacity Building Sessions. At these sessions, we get an opportunity to talk with women and men across the country about what they're doing to address these issues. And we do actions. One of the recent actions was to call our Congress and senators to halt utility cutoffs nationwide. And so it's trying to move us from just talking about it and learning about it to actually doing something. And then in February of 2020, I gathered together some people in my church who had a similar interest, and we now have a green team, and it's the organization that Dell mentioned, Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake. And we attended their all-day training. We actually saw some of the things that were being done at the site that we were trained at, rain barrels, things to help cut down on stormwater runoff. And we received a mini grant immediately after that training to help us get going. So we're starting this fall with the community garden. An IPC board member is going to come and teach our children how to build garden beds. We're having a fall tree planting, and this week we're having a water audit to just see what we can do about all the storm water runoff and steps we can take to address it. So I'm very excited and delighted to be here tonight to listen to and learn from our panel. And I'll begin the discussion, the panel discussion, with a question to each of our panelists. Following that, we will respond to questions that you submit to our panel. And our first question goes to Reverend James. What's the correlation between thousands of Black people disproportionately dying from COVID-19 and environmental racism?
That's a great question. And so when I was growing up, Cynthia, one of my favorite puzzles to do was a connected dot puzzle. And so immediately it looked like just dots on the paper, but it would tell you to connect the numbers or some type of pattern. And as you connected the dots, you would see some type of image emerge. And so as we look at the devastation of COVID-19, nearly 200,000 deaths in the US, there is a correlation. And all we have to do is connect the dots. And so long before the phrase, "I can't breathe," became a popular rallying cry for Black Lives Matter activists protesting the death of Black people at the hands of police, environmental justice activists like myself warned that pollution was choking and killing people of color in the United States of America. And so this is an issue that is directly related. Your zip code determines your health. And so it is one of the greatest determinants of health. If you ask someone for their zip code, it will let you know whether or not that is a healthy community or not. And so as we look at our conference, the Baltimore-Washington conference, the city of Baltimore in 1907 became the first city in the nation to implement on the books what we call redlining, where it denied access to housing, access to loans, access to various types of upward mobility to someone who was a person of color, Black or African American, and it basically forced them to move into certain parts of the city. And then when we look at Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. Is the tale of two cities. If you're east of the Anacostia River, you're invisible in terms of policies and in terms of all the things that go on to keep you safe. You seem not to matter like those in other wards of the district. In Ward 7, where Jones United Methodist Church is, there is a transfer station of waste in Ward 7. And that incinerator and that transfer station is polluting not only Ward 7, but also Ward 8. And so what we see is underlying conditions such as asthma, as Reverend Dale said. We see high blood pressure. We see heart disease. And so we see these chronic diseases that are already in place just due to the air pollution and being exposed to hazardous waste material. My first class on environmental law almost 30 years ago, there was something called NIMBY, not in my backyard, that we had to learn and we had to understand. And what we find is even today, because of NIMBY, a lot of things that people did not want in their backyards end up in people of color's backyards. We didn't ask for it, but somehow in some way across the nation, it ends up in our backyard. And poverty is a factor, but as we look at environmental justice, the number one determinant factor for pollution is race. If a person in our conference makes $50,000 a year, that person of color is more than likely to be exposed to pollution and hazardous waste than someone who is white earning only $10,000 per year. And so it isn't just poverty, but the determining factor is race. And so as we look at these underlying health conditions, we look at food apartheid, food deserts, food insecurity. If the only thing in your proximity is fast food, then that's what most people eat. If you don't have a grocery store, if you don't have access to fruits and vegetables, it further exacerbates your health challenges. And so as we look at a map of the United States in terms of the COVID-19 cases, what we're seeing is that about 35% to 45% of all the deaths due to COVID-19 are people of color, even though African Americans only make up about 11 to 14% of the population. And locally in the Washington, D.C., if we look at those numbers, African Americans make up 45% of the population, but 87% of all the deaths related to COVID-19 are people of color, African Americans. And so this is no accident. The hazardous waste ends up in our backyard. The incinerators ends up in our backyard. Lead paint ends up in our schools, but not up in Northwest, not in those schools. And so this is a systemic problem that we're dealing with in America. And what COVID-19 has done, Cynthia, is it made those people in those neighborhoods that were invisible now visible. And so we're seeing years and years of this systemic racism, years and years of environmental racism. We're seeing it now being exposed by COVID-19. And the final point I'll make, I know I'm throwing out a lot of numbers, but 71% of people of color in America live in an area that is qualified as high risk for air pollution. So no wonder many of our children have asthma. No wonder many of our people have problems with their lungs, problems with heart disease, and all of these underlying respiratory problems is not just because of COVID-19, but it's because of the environmental racism that has been going on for decades. So all we need to do is connect the dots as it relates to environmental racism and environmental injustice, and we can see that direct correlation to the people who are dying, the people who are exposed in Washington, D.C., Detroit, Baltimore, other urban centers in America are hit the hardest due to the particulate matter, due to the hazardous waste, due to all of these things that have been dumped in our backyards, or the neighborhood was designed and built in areas where these pollutants already occurred. So yes, there's a direct correlation between COVID-19 and environmental racism.
Reverend James, thank you. And I appreciate that you're able to give us the numbers, because it's power in that. That gives us facts. And it really hit home with me because recently there was a program about the incinerator in Baltimore City. And I wish I had the numbers, but it was many, many times higher cases of asthma in that area than anywhere else. And it was connected to that incinerator. So thank you for that. And thank you for those numbers, for those facts. Our next question is for Reverend Del Hinton. What has been your experience with greening the local urban Black church?
Well, I want to give you a little bit more context, and I want to sort of piggyback on what Reverend James has said. There's some things that we need to understand. And the United States Census Bureau of Quick Facts for Baltimore City showed that there was a 4.4 decrease in the population of Baltimore City between 2014 and 2019. The ethnic composition of the city is 62.5% identifying as African American, 2.6% identifying as Asian, 5.1% as Latino, and 27.5% as white. Now, the good thing is that 83.6% of those who are living in Baltimore City have been living in the same dwelling for a year or more. But only 47.3% of them own their homes as compared to 63.8% in the state of Maryland. And when you stop and look at the median income for Baltimore City by itself, it's $48,840, where compared to the state, it's $81,868 for the entire state. Why do I bring this up? Because when I came into the city and I started trying to figure out why we were being ineffectual as folk who are doing the work with the facilities that we have, the churches that we have, you find that less than 50%, and maybe even less than that, within your church own their property. So their exposure to certain things and the way to think about how you own property and develop that property, it's not there. And then the further you go in trying to understand how you take what is going on in your home and treating your church like your home, if you don't own it, then you don't understand how to maintain it. That's not to say that people don't have a desire to maintain their churches, but we have been left with churches with crumbling infrastructures as white flight took place in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And what we're finding is the gentrification of the communities at this point, where suddenly a desire to invest again in the communities is coming about. And we're unable to meet the needs of the community according to what we have on hand. In other words, many of us are not landowners and cannot dictate what's happening in our community. Reverend James said something about where things are being dumped. Often we find ourselves renting in communities where they're dumping. And so it's not even though it may not be in their backyard, it is in their properties that they have considered not to be of value, with people that they consider not to be of value. And our inability to affect change comes from our inability to own property and have access to determining the ultimate outcome of those properties and neighborhoods. When we start talking about what is happening with the church itself, when we talk about the local church, we're talking about people that often don't have a hammer, don't have a shovel, don't have a whole lot of other things because they don't own the property and they don't have those things to be able to fix their own property, much less to come in and fix the property of the church. We have regulated ourselves out of being able to do, I know how to do this, with members of our own congregations, that we have put in so many regulations that we have to have certified plumbers, electricians, carpenters to do the work so that they pass inspection and be able to actually affect change within our buildings. Now, the certifications also present a problem because many of our people many of our men specifically are coming out of a prison institution or situation. And we have to find a way to employ them to get them back into the system to be able to do the work. So when we have something that is wrong, we're still calling on people from the suburbs and others to do work that needs to be done within our communities. And it's not people that look like us that have the certification to do the work that needs to be done in our communities. This is not just environmental racism, but looking at environmental justice with a critical eye, not just about what needs to be fixed, but how it's being fixed, who's paying the cost, who has the responsibility for getting it fixed, and how that needs to be done. Right now in Baltimore City, we are plagued with crumbling infrastructures, not just our churches, but all around us. And we need the assistance of those who did the flight to come back and invest in this area, not to take it over, but to consider that the people that they have left here are worth living in the environment that they have developed for themselves in the suburbs or in the rural area. So coming into a church in this environment calls on us to do some partnerships. As you have heard before, we're partnering with Interfaith Power and Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake. We have partnered with IPL. We have partnered with DPW. We have partnered with all kinds of people to be able to give us access to many grants and eventually further on. We have just received our $5,000 for our grant for doing rain barrels and a garden and planting a tree. Our next endeavor will be to do something that deals with the external portion of our grounds and making sure that the water flows in just the right way. But even beyond that, we need to look at what we have to do to be in partnership with those who continue to work in the area of solar energy, wind energy, and all the other alternatives so that our buildings become self-sufficient and actually healthy to be in. We need to continue to find access to ways in which we can encapsulate lead, make sure that the pipes that we have coming into our buildings are providing good, healthy drinking water. The water in Baltimore City is very healthy, but it's the pipes that lead from that water into the building that can give us some issues. We need to continue to look at these buildings that have been built over 100 years ago, and the pipes themselves are crumbling, and we're having issues with that. Windows that were encased in lead that we need to look at. These are things that we need to continue to work with. So our issues around environmental justice and racism have nothing to do with necessarily green space. It has to do with access to those things that will change our lives for healthy living. And it also has to do with our ability to continue to work, even though we do not have maybe ownership of property, ownership of access to those who have ownership to hold them accountable for the environment that they have left us to live in. All that to say that each one of us is experiencing a decline in those who are attending our churches, almost every one of us. And our children and our grandchildren know more about how to get on the internet than they do about using a hammer and a nail on a board. and we need to start teaching some very practical lessons. So our church itself has looked at becoming a center for creation, and that is what we're striving for, teaching some basic home, we used to call it home economics, but home skills about how to fix and repair, how to eat healthy, how to live healthy, and to determine whether or not the environment that you are renting is an environment of health, and the environment that you are about to buy, whether or not it is a healthy environment to live in.
Thank you, Reverend Hinton. And I think
Thank you.
lead does continue to be a problem. And even in our churches, as we go about renovating or starting a daycare, and that's when we start to see that we can't open up right now because there's lead there. Lead that's been there and been present for our church family, but we didn't consciously seek it out. But once these things start to happen, you might see a little crumbling here and there. So I agree with you. I work with youth. Many of them don't have the basic skills. And this is all a part of what we need to be doing as we produce that next generation. And now I want to go to Daphne. Daphne, can you tell us about your work with the UMW and what you have learned about environmental justice and environmental racism?
Why, Cynthia, thank you for asking me that question. I read somewhere the other day that 20% of what you hear, you don't remember, but 80% of what you see, you do remember. And I remember doing the research for the Christian Learning Centers and trying to pull together materials to support what the national office had set down about climate justice. I ran across this book, and it was called Overdevelopment, Overpopulation, Overshoot. Now, it really was about the human birth rate in the world, how we were going to be billions and billions and billions. But actually, what was portrayed was the condition that people lived in around the world. I used to be one of those people who would say, look, I need to focus on what's happening in my neighborhood. I can't worry about the world. But actually, we need to worry about the world because the world is getting dumped on just like we are here in terms of the oil refineries, the pipelines, the garbage disposal, all of the plastic that gets into the sea, and the fish and the seals and the whales, they're eating the plastic. So, it's for me, it was a very, very complex subject. And, most people just don't look at it that way. And that was some of the responses that I received from women who visited the learning centers during Mission U. But it's really, the United Methodist Women have a history of advocacy and bringing attention to things that are going on in the world, specifically to women, children, and youth. And so, I mean, I just was like, oh my God, look at this book. And if anyone ever gets a chance to look at that book, you would be appalled. In Africa, they would kill hundreds of gorillas and use the paws and the hands because they were an aphrodisiac, all right? And you look at the tigers that are disappearing. So it's a whole lot of things that are a part of what's going on. But what really brought it home for me was the environmental racism. I was looking for articles on water, and I actually ran across an article on Destiny Watford right here in Curtis Bay. Her high school was across the field from this lot, but the state wanted to bring in an incinerator. So she started talking to her parents, she talked to her counselor, and she talked to the kids in her class, and they got together and they stopped that incinerator from coming into Curtis Bay. And I was like, there is more to the subject than what I'm really reading into it with all of the things that I had pulled together. So it just took me a while to really see environmental racism and then talk about it. So I had a whole page full of stuff that I was going to say, but actually Reverend James and Reverend Hinton, you all talk about a lot of the things that I have here in terms of the trash, which Cherry Hill is noted for. They have a huge dump down there. I was reminded the other day about a friend who I told that I was doing this, and she said, oh, you know, Cherry Hill was supposed to be a community for whites. And I was like, what? And she was like, yes. But then when they found out that the dump was down there all the way at the end, then it was another story. And the houses went empty for a while, but that's when the blacks started to come in. So I you know, it's very disheartening that those things happen. But communities where blacks or people of color and indigenous people live, they're deliberately targeted for the undesirable things that the land, for the land. Lax enforcement of the zoning and environmental laws. These communities do have and are exposed to the toxic and hazardous waste. And so the United Methodist Women really work very hard to get information out that says this is what's happening. They have a climate simulation project, and it shows how fracking and mountaintop removal is impacting communities. And their poor communities is not only people of color or indigenous people, but poor people who don't have access, as Reverend Hinton said, they don't own their land. They're just there and have really no voice. So it's something that really the United Methodist Women have petitioned to stop some of the actions that are going on. For instance, the Exxon. I had it, it's gone. But the Exxon refinery, they had a petition out and they tried to do something with that. I have a list, and I've given it to Mike, of some of the actions, which are too numerous for me to try to remember, and I really don't want to read them all, but he does have a slide, and there are 2 pages of actions and alerts and letter writing campaigns that need to be done. They are taking on some maternal and child health care issues, which everybody has talked about, but not only the asthma, but the women who are losing the battle with birth in the United States alone. And I don't have statistics on that, but it is very disheartening for us to have the kind of medical system we have, but yet women don't have health insurance where they can get it and save that pregnancy. So it's working in those learning centers really give you an opportunity to see what's going on and what the United Methodist Women are doing. The year that I hosted the People with Disabilities Act, I found that there was really a correlation with that also, in that people with disabilities don't have a lot of voice in terms of what their properties and health and land use is all about. So it's really quite a problem, the environmental racism.
Daphne, I really want to thank you. And of course, when you mentioned maternal health, one of the things at Mission U we saw was the impact the environment
Right.
on unborn babies. And now I want to move to Mike. We're kind of getting near the end of our time, but Mike, now I take it that you see climate justice, environmental justice, and environmental racism as connected. The United Methodist Draft 2020 Social Principles has a section on environmental racism, and the NAACP has an environmental and climate justice program. Why do you see that connection as important?
Yes, thank you, Cynthia. You know, the call on our lives is to love our neighbors and not to drown them or sicken them or make it impossible for them to grow their crops. And environmental degradation makes all those things a bad result. And our job is, like I said, is to love people without distinction. This is why I so appreciate the church's statement, the environmental racism section in the draft of the new 2020 United Methodist Church Social Principles begins. We confess that the negative impacts resulting from the degradation of the natural world has fallen disproportionately on marginalized communities. It starts out, we confess that. So we have to do something about that. And I also appreciate the work for environmental justice at the NAACP. The NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program was created to support community leadership in addressing this human and civil rights issue. I love the fact that Jackie Patterson, a layperson in the United Methodist Church, runs this justice program. She was the author of a chapter in the climate justice study that 10,000 United Methodist women and others engaged in. The study was a call to hope and action, and many are engaged in that action. I was also excited about the annual week-long festival of homiletics, which was offered this spring virtually for the first time. Its topic was Preaching a New Earth, Climate and Creation. Leaders who understood the environmental racism connection participated. Two of them were the Reverend Dr. William Barber, the leader of the Poor People's Campaign, and Stacey Abrams of Georgia. You know, she is the daughter of United Methodist pastors serving churches in Cancer Alley on the lower Mississippi around petrochemical and refinery plants. Both of these social justice leaders understand and talk about environmental justice and the connection to racism. A recent opinion piece in the Boston Globe stated, if you want to run a society on fossil fuels, you're going to need sacrifice zones, places where the air is thick with pollution and where climate impacts can be ignored. The fossil fuel industry depends on racism, sacrifice zones, and people that are considered disposable. Racism is killing the planet. Much has been said already about asthma. There's also cancer, birth defects, prenatal and young brain development problems for people exposed to these toxins. We could say that Black communities are on the front lines of climate change, where floods are magnified, sea level rise is happening, hurricanes and heat waves are magnified, and heat can kill. So we have to be actively anti-racist. Principles, policy, and practice that harm the marginalized disproportionately have to be upended. We have advocacy work to do. And we've had some successes in advocacy in the state of Maryland, but we have much more to do. Coming up in the next legislative session, we're going to be working on closing down coal-fired power plants that disproportionately affect African-American population. We ask you all to join the movement. Be alert for forthcoming opportunities to learn about the Maryland Environmental Human Rights Amendment. Join with our partners, Interfaith Power and Light from DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and also Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake. They work in our region around advocacy and around projects in our church property. We are strengthening our conference environmental justice network. There is work to do in individual congregations and districts, and there are projects to envision and advance, and there is advocacy work to do. We need to advance just policies. Our social principles uses the descriptive term, the community of all creation. The intersectionality of the community of all creation and being anti-racist needs to be preached and included in study opportunities. Become an anti-racist church. There are no disposable people. There is no planet B.
Thank you. That word intersectionality has just had new meaning for me lately as you start to see how that plays out across so many aspects, whether it be income inequality, and then you start to see connections to healthcare and so many connections. As we are approaching the end of our time, I noticed that we do have Reverend Jenny Phillips on the call. Is she going to be able to speak? She wanted to speak about an upcoming Earth Keepers virtual class webinar that's coming up. Reverend Phillips, welcome.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Hi, my name is Reverend Jenny Phillips. I am the Senior Technical Advisor for Environmental Sustainability at Global Ministries. I had the honor of being trained as an Earth Keeper alongside Mike Koob and getting to train Reverend Dell and Reverend Carey and Sherry Koob in their Earth Keepers trainings. And for anyone here on this call who is hearing these strong, amazing, smart people and thinking, I want to spend more time with people like that, and I want to learn to develop a project that I can do in my own community, we're working on developing a virtual Earth Keepers training for this November. It's the first one you'll get to do all online. You don't even have to travel. To stay on top of the details of that, join the Global Ministries Creation Care Network. I've dropped the link into the comments. It's http://creationcare.umcmission.org. You'll get the details on the training and also just be able to connect with a lot of other like-minded folks doing this work. Thank you so much. I am so impressed with all of you and the terrific work you're doing. I really appreciate this.
Thank you. Did we have any other questions, Stacy, that you noticed?
No other questions, just great resources in the Zoom webinar chat. I'll invite you to please see the resources there we have a resource from Laura James regarding Jackie Patterson, the Senior Director of Environmental and Climate Justice Program, resources from the Baltimore-Washington Conference, resources from the General Church, resources from the Book of Resolutions, study from Yale, many resources. We will try to capture as many as we can to send them to those who are registered here. You will also see studies from the University of Michigan and in other places, because we want to make sure that we share as many resources as possible. And if you have some, we invite you to share yours as well. We know that we are on this journey together, and that this, as Mike has said, and all on the panel, this is our moral obligation. This is our reasonable service. And as the prophet Isaiah said, just want to quote that, if it says in Isaiah chapter 58, verses 9 through 10 in the New International Version, if you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of those who are oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like noonday.
Thank you. And with those words, we'll say good night. And
Good
thank you all
night.
for attending. Thanks to all our panelists, and thanks to Reverend Stacey Cole Wilson for helping us to bring this all together. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night,
God
everyone.
bless you.
God
Thank
bless.
you.